I'd like to just call Ananth, the CEO of APPI, to lead the next session, please.
So, good afternoon. My name is Ananth. I'm the CEO of the Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives. So when Neera reached out to me and asked me if I would come and be part of, I think this panel that we just heard, my response to her was, it's not something I have been thinking about too much. I mean, a lot of sympathy for it. So I took the liberty of suggesting something that I've been thinking about as a possible topic for this conversation. I've been thinking quite a lot about how can philanthropists, philanthropy leaders, philanthropic organizations, how can they actually learn given one particular fact of their life? I think the fact of their life is that they are quite, let's say they inhabit a different reality from the realities that they are working with. So I think the topic suggests that you know, they are not in touch with reality. That may not be true. I mean, everybody lives in the real world, and there are different realities. Perhaps the correct way of describing it is the reality of, for example, this room is quite different from the reality of, say, the woman that Renu was speaking about. And it's also different from the reality of Renu, who's working with those women. So we are, in some sense, let's say, inevitably in a place where one has to find ways of bridging this distance and still learn meaningfully. I mean, still learn meaningful things, still make meaning, still be, let's say, sensitive, if I may put it that way. So as someone who, until 4 years ago, was running an organization, this is my first job in philanthropy. This has been a question, and I've also had the privilege of starting afresh a large philanthropic organization. The resources are not mine. They belong to Mr. Premji, but I've had the privilege of, you know, sort of conceiving and setting up this organization from scratch. So this has been a question that has, as you can imagine, occupied me quite a lot over the last, you know, many years, last few years rather, 3-4 years. In part because in some ways this is the transition I was making too. And quite a lot of my colleagues were also making a similar transition. You know, they have been in contexts where they're much closer to the ground. Now they're in this place. They still have to make sense of the ground. So what is it that we can do? How do we make sense? So that's really what I have been thinking about, and that's what I'd like to, a few things I've learned in that process I'd like to share with you. So I want to begin with a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. So it's about football. I read this quote during, I think, in a magazine in an airline magazine, I think, just before one of the football World Cups when everybody was kind of talking football. So apparently he said, in football, everything is complicated by the presence of the other team. So, you know, so otherwise it's an easy game. You know, it's trivial. You have a ball. I mean, every human being can walk, possibly even run, so you can kick it, and the goal is big enough for you to, you know, for you to find a way of putting it in there, right? So it's the other team that makes football complicated or interesting, you know, either way. So I used to use this to tell people about the dangers of strategy, or the limitations of strategy, if you like. You know, most strategies fail when they hit the ground. You know, most football tactics that coaches come up with seldom survive the first contact with reality, right? And the more resources you have, right, the more you tend to spend on strategy, right? I mean, that's normal. I mean, you know, there's tons of information out there. There's a lot of data. There's a whole bunch of things, whole bunch of resources one can muster and stick it at thinking through the problem, right? And then, you know, it's a very common experience that all that thinking and all that strategy doesn't survive doesn't survive very well its first contact with context, with reality. So it seemed that one might be better off doing. One might be better off learning by doing, rather than separating the two too much. Of course, one sits in rooms and thinks, and that's important. And then one goes out and does, which is equally important. But can one be more iterative about it, rather than, let's say, spend tons of time separating these two and doing this, or increasing that cycle time between learning, doing, learning, changing, that kind of a cycle, right? So one of the key lessons that I have learned is that pays off, right? In fact, what we did when we set off to begin with was to say, okay, we won't think too much about systems. We won't think too much about systems change. We don't know enough about it. It'll take us a lot of time to figure out how to change a system on whatever topic we want to. We might want to change the system that delivers nutritional services to children. We want to change the court and criminal justice system. We could think of many, many different systems that we would want to change, and those are very legitimate aspirations. But while we sit and think about it, why don't we actually get some experience? So we did what we call, a bunch of grants, quite a lot of them, which were all on the principle of supporting good people doing great work. Fairly open, fairly close to what I think has become a pejorative term, the checkbook philanthropy. But we did and we do quite a lot of that. It's both a very good learning ground. We learned tons of things. And it also seemed to provide quite excellent value in each of those grants provided good value in themselves. So the first lesson that I learned in the process is iterate, don't separate the thing too much. So it creates more opportunities to learn. It makes the problems of strategies encounter with reality more frequent and therefore more solvable. I mean, it's not like once in 2 years you have this big strategy that then encounters reality and you have this boom, right? So you have it every other month, and that's a good thing, and you can learn from it. So that's the first thought I'd like to leave with you. The second thought is, came to my mind like this. So me, my team, the Premji family, we're all thinking. We're all thinking about society. Our partners and the eventual beneficiaries, they're also thinking about their context, their own situation. They're also thinking about society. They're thinking about what to change. So somehow this idea that there are funders and there are implementers seemed a bit too straitjacketed and didn't seem to fit reality. Everyone's thinking. It's not like thought is, the only place where thinking is happening is on either side. So people are thinking. So what is it that we can think about? How can we think about, say, complementary different things that are still meaningful to the partnership? So this has been another question that I spent quite a lot of time thinking about. So in some sense, I think what I have learned is that for a philanthropist, I think very very certainly, even for philanthropic leaders, even for philanthropic organizations, I think it's far more important to cultivate a learning and an open mind than cultivate expertise. This is something that, it's come home to me very, 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 very clearly. And it's very, very important to cultivate that thing called, if I were to be sort of Zen about it, I would even go so far as to say it's important to cultivate what one would call the beginner's mind. The famous Zen quote is, "The beginner's mind has infinite possibilities. The expert's mind sees only one," right? Of course, that's an extreme case I'm making out. But I think it's very much more important to be capable of listening to be capable of making sense of, let's say, the experience that's coming from the context. So how much time do I have? 10 minutes in the Q&A. So my time is up. Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. It's always good to know. Yes. So yes. So second thing I think is to cultivate that open mindset. And today, just before this, I had 2 conversations where that thing came home to me again. And to me, it seems like the key to cultivating that mindset is cultivating trust. And I think for philanthropic organizations, this is a particular challenge for philanthropists and for philanthropic organizations. I'm not suggesting that the wealthy are somehow suspicious. I'm merely saying distance creates opportunities for the mind to not trust. Right? So that's really what I'm saying. So there's quite a lot, and part of what philanthropists and philanthropic organizations do is monitor, evaluate, ask the hard questions about, what has the money achieved, and so on and so on. All good questions, right? But can one ask those questions from a place of trust? The trust essentially being that everybody in that ecosystem, and we are privileged to work in an ecosystem where, I'm talking about what's being called the social sector. We are privileged to work in an ecosystem where, by and large, we can take integrity for granted. Integrity in the sense of being true to purpose or having a purpose. By and large, we can take that for granted, right? And that's a privilege. But in that ecosystem, can one, let's say, learn the inner discipline, if one likes, of coming from a place of trust? So I was meeting, one of our partners, and Sujata Lavande of Coro, just before this talk, and she was saying that if there was trust, we would open up, and then you would really know what's going on. We would be able to tell you, these are our problems, these are the things that we do well, these are things that don't go well, etc., right? So, and in quite a different way, in the conversation I had just before walking into this room, you, Peggy, were telling me the same thing, that the core, the thing that actually makes for system change, very different level of operation, but the thing that actually makes for system change is trust. That's what lasts beyond the project in some sense. That's really what trust between different stakeholders. That's the context we're speaking about. But nevertheless, to me, the key lesson seemed to be that if we learn to trust, I'm not suggesting innocence or a childlike naivety, but I'm saying if one comes from a position of trust, a consciously cultivated position of trust, then I think one would learn a lot more, because minds become open. Your mind, everybody's mind becomes open, right? So that's the second thing. So the first thing I learned was, learn iteratively, do iteratively. Second thing I learned is, it's important to cultivate a learning mindset, and the cornerstone of that, in my opinion, is trust. The third thing I would say is, I think it's very important, is for people to, particularly for philanthropists, to understand themselves quite a lot. I think very often, the intent is quite clear. The intent to make a difference is quite clear, but and the intent is often multidimensional, right? It's not just one thing, but it's important to understand quite well, what you bring by way of mental models, by way of things that way your cognition works to a situation. It's important to be aware of that. And I think that's true, very true for philanthropists, but it's also true for people like me who are who are professionals in the field, including the question of what actually makes me feel good. Because without that, you would not be able to know what is out there when you're talking to somebody and what's in here. One of the big cognitive, let's say, shortcuts that we're all evolutionarily programmed with is to sort of project, is to the fallacy of attribution, so to speak. What's in here, you tend to attribute to what's out there. So that seems to be, my favorite way of asking the question is, I think all of us have a hammer. The man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail in that frame. All of us have a hammer, right? I think the key question is, do we know how to find the nail, right? I mean, a hammer we can't do anything about. That's the hammer we are. But can we actually go and find a nail for that hammer rather than go and hit that glass door because we think it's a nail, right? So it's very important for us to so then we come with a certain degree of openness. And I think the last point I want to make is, one of the challenges of the philanthropist's life is that they're destined to visit 100 places one time, right? Or 1,000 places one time. I'm sure, Peggy, you've been to possibly 1,000 places one time. But there is a place she has been to 100 times, presumably Orissa, several times. So that seems to be another important thing. There must be a particular place, and I think it's a place, it's a geography, which you have a deeper connection with, where you're not in the same mode, where you're in the sort of opposite mode, where your context, where context is rich and ideas are poor. So that's the last thing I would say. That's something that creates balance as well. And she says Q&A. So off we go. I'll sit down.
And I'll just start again. I thought one of your first points was super interesting. To not think about systems change or not to not think about system change, but to not start with a systems change mindset and sort of get your hands in and iterate. Could you walk through maybe a couple or a single example in that very sort of specific where that's borne fruit and strategically been very effective?
Yes. So if I may point out, I didn't suggest iteration as a way to getting to strategy, or what seemed like strategy. Iteration is a way to learn and is a way to do better what you're doing. Yeah? So it may end up in something that looks like strategy to begin with. It may end up in a different place. Yeah? So, but iteration is the way to learn. Okay? So I'll give you an example. So one of the vulnerable communities that we are interested in are street children, right? So we started by doing grants to well-known organizations working with street children, who run shelters, who run these wonderful education programs all across the country. So very quickly we built up a portfolio of grants to them. And then through that we learned something, which was actually quite interesting. It may not be surprising to anybody who's working with them, but to us it was surprising. Which was that we learned that there was something common to all, say, 90% of the children who are on the street today. And that what is common is not something like they're all poor or something like that, but there's something common to all of them. Any guesses? Sorry? There are quite a lot of them that like the freedom, but it's not 90%. 90% of them don't like their situation. It's unsafe. They know that too. Yeah. So, sorry? They are with their parents. No, actually, I'm not talking. That definition got excluded. That got excluded from the definition of street kids. We're not talking about families living on the street. We're talking about children, unattended, unadult supervised or unadult looked after children. So, just in the interest of time, the answer is they all ran away from home on a train. So that's a very strange answer. So, but and it's even stranger that I think it's of some great significance. But it is because the railway network is the only way in which somebody without money can travel long distances in this country. And most of them are running away from a bad situation at home, which includes poverty, but is not limited to poverty. they want to get to the cities so they can find a job or do something. So the train is the only way. So so the idea that came was if you were to, and some of our partners are working in railway stations. So the idea was if you were to put together a safety net around the top 50 railway stations of the country, you could cover 80% of the kids because the railway network is automatically concentrated. It has points of high concentration, if you like, right? So, and that is something that we could do. Yeah? So that's an example of what went on.
Hi, Ananth. Here, it's Ingrid.
Yes, next to you.
Is there a way of, does constituency feedback, constituent voice or participatory grant making, or this new thing called Yelp for foundations, which allows NGOs to provide anonymous feedback on their grant makers, is that one way of sort of addressing the gap?
Yeah, definitely. I think systematic feedback, not just from the NGO. One of the points I was going to make is the ecosystem at this point of time seems to be turned towards money, right? If everybody's attention could turn towards the community, right? So if everybody could listen, I would say one of the weaknesses of the social sector ecosystem is that there's insufficient attention to by all players to the eventual quote-unquote beneficiary. So in that sense, I think if as philanthropists we can turn everybody's head the other way, it'd be very useful. So you were going to ask.
What I found very interesting was that your connection with trust, and then you talked about cognitive bias, and in fact, your people's cognitive biases actually create distrust sometimes, even though there's transparency. What have you found with APPI through this time of which organizations that you fund have created trust, and what have been the prerequisites, and how have they done that? I mean, I assume now through that iterative process, you now have a stable of organizations that you fund, and there's certain ingredients that you look for in what has created trust at APPI. So where have you, so if what you talked about is the start of your journey, now in the middle of the journey, what are your ingredients?
Quickly, she's already held up the stop sign, so I'll do this quickly, and maybe we can say more. I think the first thing we've learned is that, by and large, as I said, by and large, we operate in an ecosystem where trust as a default setting is not naive, is a good default setting to have. So consciously train yourself to be trusting is a good position to have. Time has confirmed that for us. The second thing I would say on the same question of what we have learned is that trusting makes for open conversations, and that again we have learned is true, right? And it has allowed us to sort of expose ourselves a little bit, and allowed the partners also to expose their real situation, so we can get into a real conversation, right? That's really what it is. But it's still early stages. We are only now building the second round of partnerships with organizations. Still early stages. I think I'm not allowed to take another question, but
I'm sorry, I wanted to turn the trust question the other way around. Why should we, I've worked with an NGO for 45 years in Mumbai, why should we trust you? When we read the newspapers these days, or even with CSR commitments that they drop because the chief executive has not he's done something and the company hasn't made a profit, or we read that a particular foundation attached to a particular company is not, perhaps we shouldn't be taking a grant from them. Well, this trust always seems to come from top down. How can the donors in the room, how can the foundations prove to the NGOs that we should trust you?
Very good question. I was only speaking about what is it that we should do better, right? And I think the jury is out on whether we are trustworthy or not. Yeah, so I wouldn't venture there. I was just speaking from what is useful for us to do. That's really where I was coming from. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you, Neera, and for having me do this. Create my own topic and speak to it is great. Thank you.